The election of Tony Blair in 1997 changed the course of British politics.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
But how did New Labour seize power after 2 decades in the wilderness? And what was it like behind the scenes of the campaign for 2 broadcasting legends who were there for every single minute of it? Let's rewind the clock almost 30 years. And this is Old Newscast. Well, joining us down the line is Kirsty Wark. Hello, Kirsty.
Hey, hello.
And what were you doing in 1997?
1997, I was following the election, and then I presented the election programme in Scotland that night.
And here in the studio with me is Jeremy Vine. Hi, Jeremy.
Gosh, you're taking me back here.
That's the point of the format.
I think I was 32 or something.
Okay.
1997.
You were 40.
And did you had a specific deployment, didn't you? In
Well, I was in the political unit with people like Mark Mardell, Nick Robinson, John Sargent, and I was told to go on the Blair battle bus. So I ended up in that situation where I was really grieving the professionalism of the Blair outfit. So they had 3 buses, and it says something like New Britain, New Labour, vote for the future. And then occasionally one of the buses would be overtaken by a van saying, buy your sausages here. So we thought that was as exciting as it got, that the message was broken up by an advert for mince pies or whatever. And then I was talking to John Sopel, my colleague, who was on the major bus, to John and he said there's like chaos here. It's like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire.
Right, okay, because the control freakery of the Labour Party.
Because politics is what happens inside parties, not between them. And there was nothing happening inside Labour for at least 8 years after that.
Because they were so disciplined.
So disciplined, yeah.
Let's rewind a little bit.
There's lots happening, but a lot in Scotland happening. We had
True.
a parliament, I'd say.
Very true. But not so much argument among Labour in Westminster,
But that was the zip, as you say, it was it still Tim Allen along with, by then, Alistair Campbell came in, Mandelson was out very quickly after his first scandal, remember?
Shall we rewind a little bit? And Kirsty, just remind us of what the dying days of John Major's Conservative government was like, and remind us of what sleaze was.
Oh, well, there was lots of things going wrong. There was scandal after scandal. There was sleaze. There was cash for questions. But remember that we also had Black Wednesday. So the whole idea of economic competency went out the window. And then we also had problems in Europe. So it was like the last of days. John Major came in 1990 when Mrs. Thatcher tearfully left. And after that, it was a kind of management of decline. And it certainly was in Scotland, for sure, because obviously Labour had a complete hegemony in Scotland. They were the establishment. And that's really what led to some of the interesting stuff that then went full speed ahead before the election, which was, you had 1992, you had Kinnock, falling out, and you had John Smith coming in, and that's when things started to ratchet up, and there was a change of atmosphere ahead of the 1997 election.
And Jeremy, Tony Blair gets all the credit, doesn't he? But actually, John Smith, before he died, put in a lot of the groundwork.
Yes, that's true. I mean, when he was Shadow Chancellor under Kinnock, he released a shadow budget which blew the 1987 election for them. So let's not forget that. And there was someone off the record in Labour's quoted as saying he's less busy than he ought to be and less clever than he thinks he is. So he was on the receiving end a lot. Clearly a great man and a titan of old Labour. And actually, the funny thing was, sad funny, just before he died, he reached the absolute moment of maximum impact, John Smith. And I don't know if you remember this, Kirsty, but a whole load of things went wrong for John Major at the same moment, or went wrong for Britain. One of them was that the Grand National didn't start, and the other one was that a hotel in Scarborough was filmed falling into the sea. And John Smith did this fantastic Prime Minister's Questions, where he says, here he is, the Prime Minister with the non-Midas touch in a country where the Grand National doesn't start and the hotels fall into the sea. And I thought, blimey, this guy's the next Prime Minister. And then he was dead less than a week later. I came in that morning early on the Westminster shift because I was just one of the sort of bunnies running around the Westminster unit, which to me was the greatest job I've ever had. and someone said he's had a heart attack in the shower, and I had to go down to Labour headquarters, which was then in Walworth Road, and the first person I saw was Phil Woolas, who's since died, but he was in tears. And I thought, whatever's happened here is massive. And then we didn't have News Channel, we didn't have 5 Live, so it was a breaking story, news flash across all the outlets, BBC One, BBC Two. And they came to me on the phone, and I remember saying, I think they said, what'll happen next? And I said, I think it'll be Tony Blair. So it was kind of obvious that Blair was the only one who was going to do it.
I remember somebody coming into our chemistry class in school to say that John Smith had died. Like, that's how the news got broken in those days.
Yeah, it was a shock, and it was terrible. Yeah.
It was such a shock. But the thing about John Smith was, and I kind of disagree. I think he absolutely made the weather for what happened to the rest of the 1990s. Because what had happened was you had Labour votes in Scotland being delivered in sackloads. And they had been being delivered in sackloads for a very long time. And essentially, they were the establishment in Scotland, but people were voting for them. So he dies dreadfully, sadly, in 1994. And I can remember at the funeral, I mean, which was so desperately sad. But I have to say that people were looking at Blair, and they were looking at Brown, and they were looking at Mandelson in the church.
Yeah, I remember that, because I remember them. Prescott said we all looked like the mafia here, because they were all dressed in black coming out of this beautiful church. And it was, do you know the funny thing about it, Kirsty? I called my grandmother, who's dead now, but she was, classic granny figure on the right, and she was in tears. And I thought, Labour are now central to British political life. I would disagree on, I think Smith to Blair was a change from old Labour to new Labour. And it was Blair who said, no, we've got to completely change the party, for better or worse, because obviously I think they're still reeling from the effect of having Blair as leader, who arguably wasn't part of the Labour Party at all.
And also just in terms of, there was such a groundswell because the Gallagher brothers are at the Brits in 1996 and Noel backs Blair to be Prime Minister.
What happened in the run-up to the election was that even journalists, and perhaps more print journalists, became to be quite enthralled to Blair, enthralled to New Labour, the excitement of it all, that whole fairy dust of endorsements, the fact the Sun backed Blair, remember? You got to remember what was happening there, that the effective opposition, where was the opposition? I mean, where was an effective opposition at that point? But Labour was still worried. They went between incredible optimism and confidence to absolute terror that something was going to go wrong.
I was going to say the opposition, of course, was William Hague and the Conservatives, and William Hague later described himself as being on the night shift. And I had to go to that first Conservative conference in 1997 where they were wiped out. And one of the stories that happened was that Alan Clark, kind of very, not dissident, but let's just say unusual MP, had given a fringe event where he'd said, of course, the solution to the situation in Northern Ireland is just shoot 600 people in one night. And the UN would make a fuss about it, but the problem would be over for 30 years. And the whole room applauds. And the Conservative HQ are in such disarray, they actually have to deny its official policy.
Right.
So I thought this is going to be a long road back. And I'm watching Kemi Badenoch to see, can she skip the night shift?
Yes.
Really interesting.
And we're skipping through multiple timelines very quickly here. So
Yes,
let's go back to our original timeline. It's going to be great. We were all in the same ex-journalist benevolent home in our 90s. We're back.
I think we're there now.
Yeah, I think so.
So the election hasn't even happened yet in our timeline. It's 1996. All the shenanigans are happening at the Labour Party conference. Yes. Then Major calls the election, and Kirsty, he goes quite long, doesn't he? He calls very
long. He thinks that what he's going to do is going to. I just think what happened was he actually thought that something would crash and burn for Labour on the way of that long road to the election. But actually, in fact, the opposite happened, because Labour actually got their act really together. They spent an awful lot of money. It was before there was any rules really about what to spend in elections. They obviously had a very plush bus that Jeremy went on, but that was the least of it. And so what you had was they made great preparation. They didn't do anything as 1997 was not the age of social media, but they got out there and the enthused people
the joy of being a political correspondent then in the Westminster lobby was this, that month after month, I hadn't realised if you've got 650 mainly men who are quite old in a room, i.e. the House of Commons, you've got quite an attrition rate. You've got people keeling over. And John Major had one squeaked a majority in 92, and gradually he went into a minus.
Yeah.
And you're then governing as a minority party. And
wheeling in people from hospital to vote.
And using the Ulster Unionists and whatever. Jim Molyneux, you know. So we had a thing at the weekend. Someone rings from the newsroom, and obviously they always come over as if they know everything, and you're sort of running to keep up. And they said, there's been a resignation threat from John Gorst. I'm thinking, I don't know who the hell that is. Now, do you know?
No.
Do you know,
enlighten me.
Kirsty?
No, I still don't know who
So
that
I'm
is.
looking, who the hell? I say, what? You're joking? Let me chase this up. It turns out Sir John Gorst is the MP for Hendon. And he's threatened to resign the party whip unless the new hospital is built in his constituency. I'd never heard of this guy. But that was
the Tory chaos.
He leads the news calling for a new hospital in Hendon. Once they realised anything they did got on the news. I met someone the other day. She said, oh, my father was a Tory MP. You won't know him. I said, well, try me. And she said, oh, this guy called David Martin. I said, yeah, he resigned as PPS to Douglas Hurd over Europe. And she said, how do you do that? I said, well, he led the news.
Yes, because that was how fragile the government was.
Yeah, and
every little thing was a big thing.
And it finances itself, that chaos. That's the trouble.
Yeah, it does. But also, you can see, I can remember the kind of sense of, head in hands as the election campaign continued.
Yeah.
And they were dealing with questions and debates about Tory sleaze, about Europe, way back to things that happened in the early 90s. Black Wednesday kept coming up. Tory disarray kept coming up. It was after 18 years, there was just an inevitability that something was going to change. And so you had people who I'm absolutely sure were not conservatives. Sorry, were conservative. People I'm absolutely sure were conservatives were thinking, we're going to vote tactically because I don't actually think that this can survive in this form for much longer.
And there's always an image, and the image was John Major. And I think he was told, he was making a speech at a dinner, and they said, we'd love, it's traditional, the person speaking does a little limerick. Could you write one? So he puts his head in his hands to think up this limerick. And that John Major head in hands photo is the seminal photo of the whole thing. So he was a slightly hapless figure, although I think it much better regarded now. Hugely. Looks 7 years. That's a lifetime.
It's a lifetime, yeah. Right. So the election is underway. Jeremy Vine is on this fabled battle bus.
His speech, we all used to take bets on which bits of the speech would be in which order because he had certain key phrases. I believe as a country, we've got to move forwards. And he would put them all in different orders. And so we would duck out sometimes and just sort of watch from a distance or just be there. And there was a speech. I remember there's a day we went to Southampton. He was in the university lecture theatre making his speech. And then we and I was in the canteen actually eating a piece of chocolate gâteau. And we heard this.
How do you remember that detail?
A large piece of chocolate gâteau. I remember this very well. And there was then this applause. So we said, okay, they're all coming out. Campbell comes first, and as he walks past my table, he grabs my fork and he just kind of stabs the gâteau with it and takes a large piece, puts it in his mouth and walks off almost without breaking his stride.
This is why you remember what you're eating.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. So then Blair comes out behind Campbell. He sees all the press there and says, hi, guys, how you doing? And I say, well, not very well, because your press secretary just ate half my gâteau. And this amazing man who'd answered questions on the euro and the minimum wage and the health service and etc. just couldn't process the gâteau comment. His eyes dart around as if he's calculating the electoral effect of the scandal. And then he just says, we're making progress. And walks off. And I thought, I've jumped him out of the groove there. That's what's happened here.
Yes, you said something that he just couldn't compute.
He couldn't. And it was like Reagan, when he had any problems, he would just say, we're heading in the right direction. And I thought, that's when you hear someone say we're making progress. That's now the default, the emergency button.
Kirsty, just remind us what Mandelson's role was in 97.
Well, actually, Mandelson's role was still, informally, complete eminence grise, but he was really running the campaign. He, as far as I remember, he was the man that was putting all the people in the right places. Literally a year before his fall from grace, his first fall from grace. He was always appeared at my shoulder when you were doing something. He was always there. it just suddenly appeared. And he was the one who was saying, well, I think you'll find that what Tony meant to say was this. Or I think you'll find that what Gordon meant to say was that. He was monitoring things very, very closely, keeping a very close control. I am right. He was running the campaign, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, but maybe without that official role. I did, because of course Blair called him Bobby, reference to Bobby Kennedy, showing how close they were because of Jack and Bobby Kennedy. My first memory when I arrived at Westminster, and I've got to say, I'm a bit of a political nerd like you, Adam, and like Kirsty. So for me, I know they say politics is show business for ugly people, but I genuinely thought I'd walked into a movie set. To look around in 1993 I arrived, and to see someone like Michael Heseltine or John Biffin or, some of these, actually John Smith, and, to have John Prescott say, oh, Jeremy, and oh my goodness, this guy knows who I am, was incredible. So the first time I met Mandelson, I was standing in the street. Mandelson walks up to me wearing this tweedy houndstooth yellow jacket, which looks to me like a country squire who's retired. And I said, how are you doing? What are you up to? Because I'm kind of fascinated by this guy who's got, as far as I can tell, no political future whatsoever under Smith, because Smith hates him. And he says, well, John has let me do something on Vera Lynn. And I said, well, what the hell do you mean by that? Now, what had happened was John Major had decided to have a VE Day anniversary thing. And it was really half-assed. It was things like spam fritter frying. Right. And then Vera, and Mandelson said, I'm in touch with Vera, and I think she may be able to help. And I thought, I didn't know what he was talking about. Like, You'd given me a blank expression. The following day, the next weekend, the Sunday Times, John Major's VE Day commemorations in chaos as Vera Lynn pulls out. So I thought, that's
how... He convinced Vera Lynn to pull out to make the government look bad.
And there was a whole thing about we're going to have street parties, but no one wanted them. And there was spam fritter frying and who wants to do that. And that was my first indication. You never saw the name of Mandelson anywhere near the story. Right. And I thought, oh, that's what he does.
The dark arts.
That's it. And then subsequently brought in by Blair in the very first political conference I went to where he was, and I was again young and silly, and I said, oh, hello Peter, are you the dark master, are you the puppeteer? And he said, can I make it clear to you, Jeremy, I'm not pulling any strings, I'm not the Prince of Darkness, and I'm not manipulating anyone. And then his phone went and he turned away from me and he just went, this must be diffused. So that's when he really started being Peter Mandelson.
Okay, that's inhabiting the character. What were your encounters with Tony Blair like in that period?
I didn't actually have very many encounters with Tony Blair. Encounters with Alistair Campbell. Alistair Campbell used to get very upset when my conservative, I think, voting mother would play golf with his aunt in Kilmarnock, and to remind him that not all of his family was necessarily on the left was actually very funny. You could always get a rise out of him. And he's so funny, Alistair Campbell, because he is a human being who has actually got a very soft side, and it can be very funny. And, he has an incredible connection with Scotland, but he can just sometimes, he could just sometimes flip into somebody who is actually really incredibly rude and forthright. And the interesting thing about that was that Blair would see that, but nothing would happen because Blair needed Alistair more than I suppose a symbiotic relationship, of course. But he really needed Alistair to behave that way to keep things in order before the election and more formally after the election.
And also, Kirsty, I mean, you were saying you weren't hanging out with Blair very much, but his persona, it's a terrible cliche to say he was a rock star, but he was like a superstar, wasn't he, at that point? Blair
was somebody who very... And I think there's no mistake that the reason for some of the things that happened was there were a lot of lawyers around, and he knew what he had to do. His absolutely great move was on a clause 4, there's no doubt, because that moved the Labour Party way ahead. He got that monkey off his back. Militant had already been dealt with. People were desperately worried that they were going to be out of purpose, so they essentially went along with New Labour. Whether they believed in, anything he was going to be doing with schools after the election or anything, they were prepared to put up with it to get into power, is what I think about Blair.
And then, Jeremy, the campaign itself that Labour ran was the goals were quite modest. The policies were quite modest.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in Westminster working in the 90s, I suddenly realised I couldn't really have any political convictions, because what I realised is the louder they shout at each other, the more they agree. And that, to me, meant the whole thing was to some degree performative. But I did get to know Blair a bit because I was on the battle bus. They had three. Most of the time, the journalists were stuck in the third one and he was in the first one. But sometimes there were moments when I was in the bus on my own and he was in the front. You know, it was that crazy. And I remember one time it was Berry. I was, testing myself here. Backbencher who used to work for the Bank of England called Ruth Kelly. Was she Berry or Bolton?
No, Ruth Kelly.
Yeah, so she was standing in that election, and the bus. He'd come on the bus and he'd waved and people had cheered, and then the doors closed and then the windows were all smoked so no one could see him. So he came and sat with me and someone brought him a cup of tea. And I said, you know, do you worry that... I was trying to think, how do I make conversation? As Adam says, there's a rock star element. We're right in the middle of a general election. And I said, do you worry that with all that power you won't be able to change anything? I mean, is it not... I said, is it not... Can you not do more as a Christian yourself, Tony, to just try to sort of improve the life of your next door neighbour? Now, actually, as it turns out, that was a very bad question, because his next door neighbour would be Gordon Brown, and they famously fell out for years and years and years. So we had this weird conversation where we were kind of fencing, and he then said, "Yeah, because you've got a faith as well, Jeremy." Again, you know, and he was incredibly personal to me. And then he said, "You're wearing the same shoes you wore yesterday," and I said, "God, you're observant. That's incredible." And I left thinking, this guy's phenomenal, like Clinton was.
Yeah.
So Clinton could never get out of a room because he would talk and talk, and you'd lock on, and he would never let you go. But two things happened then that made me realise this was not the case. Every interview he gave me after that, he said, "You're wearing the same shoes you wore last time." I thought, oh, this is your thing, is it?
Yes.
Because then I think, oh, you've got a great memory. I was wearing different shoes.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to point it out. And the other thing was, and this is going to sound very self-centered, and I did like him very much, but I also thought he's made me think that he likes me, but he doesn't. He doesn't care. And the reason I say that was, at some point, this will make you laugh, during the whole Labour years, they released a list of all the journalists who'd been to Chequers. And I tell you something, every single bloody journalist in Britain was on that list except me. Every single one. But I became, this is the classic political correspondent thing. You become fascinated with your quarry, don't you?
Yeah,
presenters are fascinated with presenters.
Yeah, I think some journalists became almost too enthralled, simply, not suggesting you, but simply because they knew that you were better to be with the person that was about to become Prime Minister, clearly, than someone who was about to leave. I mean, that was always going to be the case. But it was the fact that they were this group of, relatively young people. You know, there was Mandelson, obviously there was Tim Allen then, and there were others too, smart people like Robin Cook, Alistair Darling, Gordon Brown, all those people, the fallouts were way ahead. We didn't know half of what was going on, really, but it was obviously going to be a tussle. We didn't really know. And the thing was that I think that Gordon was so much old Labour and new Labour, that he was dyed in the wool. But Tony was just, people started to talk about him as a Johnny come lately. He was new Labour, but was he as committed to the cause? That's what I think I feel now. And I think that obviously the legacy has been, Iraq has actually made a huge dent in that legacy. But I think he was the man to get it across the line. He was absolutely the man to get it across the line.
Well,
and by the time,
yeah. But I mean, I think Corbyn was a vomiting out of the Blair history. And I think when I was at Westminster briefly after the 97 election, you see they got 400 Labour MPs. If you put them in a line from the most left wing to the most right wing, Tony Blair would be the last one on the line. I don't think he was ever Labour at all. I'm sorry to say it. I know he was he had a Labour Party card, but
maybe it was. But the thing was, maybe it was performative, and they knew they had to have him. They knew he would get them in.
Yeah, and also I've heard people argue, when I've said this before, they've said, well, wait a minute, had he not been Labour in his heart, he, as the person who failed to win in Beaconsfield, would have gone with the SDP in 1983. And it was you had to really believe in the cause to stay during Michael Foot's Labour.
Yes.
So there's that. Can I just say, I was going to say, I've got Mandelson. I just wanted to make sure we mentioned the Littleborough and Saddleworth by-election, which I had to go to, which was in the middle of the 90s when Blair said to Mandelson, all right, let's see what you can do. And I covered the Littleborough and Saddleworth by-election. I was up there for 5 weeks for this thing. And it was a Tory seat that Labour thought they could get, and Mandelson had to do the whole campaign. And so that was fascinating to just see him being placed in the cockpit to see if he could do it.
Interesting. Just going back then to 97 and the Labour's modest ambitions, because there was the pledge card, wasn't there, which has become...
5 pledges.
Yeah, like a totemic thing in Labour. And I've got them written down here, so you don't have to remember them. So it was cutting class sizes to under 30 for 5, 6 and 7-year-olds, introducing a fast-track punishment scheme for persistent young offenders, cutting NHS waiting lists by treating an extra 100,000 patients and releasing £100 million saved from NHS red tape, get 250,000 under 25-year-olds off benefits and into work by using money from a windfall levy on the privatised utilities because the utilities have just become privatised, and setting tough rules for government spending and borrowing, ensuring low inflation and strengthening the economy so that interest rates are as low as possible to make all families better off. What a mouthful. Hard to remember those 5 points. But Jeremy, actually, that doesn't really tell us anything about what the Labour government ended up being like.
No, because you didn't include declare war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the fact that we were arguably grievously unprepared going into the world's biggest financial crisis, that we overspent at the top of the boom, and that you end up politically with this really unfortunate TBGBs, as it was called, where, we'll never really understand exactly how bad that got. But I read a great book by Andrew Rawnsley called The End of the Party, which is all about how you were either one or the other. Like the Thatcher phrase, is he one of us? And that was, why is it that this Chancellor Prime Minister thing happens again and again and again? Lawson, Thatcher, So that, they could have put that on the pledge card. We promised to fall out with each other within 5 years.
The deal had been done, I think, before the election, but not announced, that Gordon Brown would be allowed to announce the independence of the Bank of England. And I think what Blair did was he kind of left that economic stuff to Brown.
Yeah, for sure.
And and that was quite a big deal. It wasn't a pledge card, of course, but I think it was quite a big deal.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And that was day 2 of the Labour government, wasn't it?
And we can't always see where we are in the cycle. So to be fair to Brown, he didn't know we were at the top of the biggest boom in history when he was spending 3% more than we were taking in tax. And he didn't know that 25% of all corporation tax was just phantom receipts from banks that were already bust. So and
the economy was growing quarter after quarter after quarter.
Yeah,
after
for
quarter.
sure. And so you add and you pay more, and then we have the financial crisis and COVID and Brexit, and now we're in a different world.
Kirsty, just going back to how the 1997 election played out on a sort of daily basis, obviously there was no social media, people didn't really have mobile phones, there was no TV debates. A lot of it was quite old-fashioned, and things like a daily press conference every morning where Blair and Brown would sit there and just take loads of questions from people for like 2 hours.
And it ended up being totally boring in a way. There was absolutely nothing to do except look at their body language or the way that they addressed each other or who decided to add. I don't actually remember much else happening. I don't actually remember them being together every day.
I'm getting confusion. The War of Jennifer's Ear was 87. Is that right? The Grommet.
So the
Prescott Punch was 2001?
Yeah.
Okay, so there was nothing happening in 97.
So actually it was quite boring.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the other thing is the greatest elections are the ones you can't predict, and this was also predictable.
Yeah, but yes, it was absolutely predictable. But then what happened was that the constitutional issue was not just about Scotland, it was then about thinking about how you would change the big cities. And look, we've now just obviously had a big, we've now got a leader, a Labour leader, and indeed a Labour Prime Minister who had been obviously in Westminster, but then went on to really recast the whole idea of a mayor and a greater, because it was always going to be that. The big failure, one of the big failures, early failures, was the idea of these regional assemblies. As if they had said, well, actually, Scotland will get an election, so we'll have to have regional assemblies and Newcastle and regional assemblies, but that never happened. Remember that devolution never worked out because it was boring.
I mean, I think, yeah.
For me, what I love is I think Scottish politics are endlessly interesting, I have to say. And actually, I think the machinations that we didn't really know about straight after the election, about the resistance, when they were putting together the whole idea of a Scottish Parliament, the resistance from people apparently like Jack Straw and all the Westminster mandarins to anything that, luckily, Donald Dewar was a smarter lawyer than a lot of them, to put together how that was all going to operate. And it was meant to deliver a different kind of politics where you would never have a single party in power. Look how that played out latterly.
So we got to the end of this quite boring, but sort of a bit cinematic election.
Not boring.
Let me talk about the program for a second, because I think it is interesting So what happens is that David Dimbleby comes on air and talks about, this is, what's going to happen in this election. Obviously, we have the exit poll, etc., etc.
And as Big Ben strikes 10, the polls close, we can give you the results of our exit poll. We've spoken to 14,000 people in 200 constituencies tonight, and we hope they've been telling us the truth. There it is, 10 o'clock, and we say Tony Blair is to be Prime Minister and a landslide is likely. And reaction from Sedgefield already down there on the right in the Labour Club, all applauding there, Conservative Party headquarters, rather more sombre scenes. So here are the details. Tony Blair to be Prime Minister, and this is why. Labour, 47%. The Conservatives, 29%, according to our exit poll. That would be the worst result, not just this century, but if you care to go back that far, to the Tory vote after the Great Reform Act in 1932, when they were led by the Duke of Wellington.
One of the biggest things that's going to happen in that election is a recasting of politics in the UK. And the BBC doesn't even mention those words. And hardly talks about Scotland in the first half hour. It was hilarious. And then I never saw this, of course, because I was on air in Scotland. And then you get Frank Skinner, an enormous amount of money, flying around England in a helicopter, checking out what's going on at the counts and things like that. I think, who dreamt that up? And which Swiss bank account did we put money into after that?
I remember in my house, we bought a new TV for election night.
Well, I was tricked by Alistair Campbell. So I said to Alistair, who obviously didn't like me, I don't mind that at all. I wouldn't want him to like me. I get on well with him now. But I said to him, where's Blair going to be on the night? Because they've said to me, you can go wherever you want on the night. He said, right, what you need to know is, but it's secret, don't tell anyone, Royal Festival Hall. That's where you need to be. He's arriving there early. So I turned up at the Royal Festival Hall, and it turned out the party was... Hang on, it was somewhere else because Francine Stock was there. So I was at wherever I was, the wrong place. Oh, yeah, it was no, he said, sorry, I've got it wrong. He said Millbank Tower, massive party.
Because that was Labour
That's
election.
Labour get to Millbank Tower. And I was on the doorstep for 7 hours without seeing anybody while Francine Stock was at the Royal Festival Hall interviewing everybody.
Yes.
Bless her. So I thought that's a last blooming dagger blow from Campbell.
Yes,
that's
a
it.
dodgy tip-off.
Oh,
and Kirsty
not dodgy, just dishonest.
And Kirsty, just explain what was happening at the Royal Festival Hall.
Oh, the Royal Festival Hall was the great and the good. There were all sorts of cultural people there. There were MPs, and it was essentially a crowning, wasn't it? I mean, I wasn't there.
I was there, so I was sent there in the early hours of the morning, and I had to stand with that extraordinary group of people, Mandelson dancing with Kinnock, do you remember? And then they kept saying, well, Blair's coming, he's not coming. And it just took ages because I wanted Dimbleby to throw to me to say, and Blair's arriving. And what
because
I
Blair
realised,
had spent election night in Sedgefield, his constituency in the north of England.
So I had finally got to where the party was, albeit 8 hours later than I should have been. And the thing that I realised, and I should have realised that the significance of this at the time, was that Blair's arrival was being delayed so that he could step onto the stage just as the first ray of sun hit the stage. So we already had dawn, it was light, but he hadn't got the sun. And that, when you think Gordon Brown, when he became Prime Minister, the very first press conference he did, his whole head was hidden by a pillar.
Yeah.
It may be that if you elect a guy who's going to time it to the sun, you've got the wrong guy.
And the reason they were timing it to the sun was so that Blair could deliver this incredibly famous soundbite.
Well, a new dawn has broken, has it not? And it is wonderful. We always said that if we had the courage to change, then we could do it, and we did it. Let me say this to you. The British people have put their trust in us. It is a moving and it is a humbling experience. And the size of our likely majority now imposes a special sort of responsibility upon us. We have been elected as New Labour and we will govern as New Labour.
And then, Kirsty, I mean, I hate saying, what was the mood of the nation that morning? But I remember it feeling like everyone was quite excited.
I think people were excited because it was something different. It was something new. Remember that they'd had really, practically since the end of 1990, they'd had a kind of sleaze-ridden government, which economically was all over the place, which, as far as Europe was concerned, was all over the place as well, though that never went away. And at that time, do you remember that? I can remember, and I think Jeremy's done a bit of this, that there was something about John Major, who now seems incredibly statesmanlike, but then he just seemed so single note that I can't remember one thing that he delivered that the country was enthused by. They may have agreed with it, but they weren't enthused by. And in a sense, that's exactly what happened with Starmer.
Yeah, I would say Major, so different from Starmer. Major could look down a camera lens and you felt he was actually a presenter in a way. He was no good at speeches, but he could do a one-on-one very, very well. The funny thing is that there was a journalist who started this thing that he tucks his shirt into his underpants, and the journalist was Alistair Campbell of the Daily Mirror. So Campbell was already on manoeuvres at that point.
Creating this sort of caricature of Major as sort of a tragic old man.
Yeah, but I think the word we're looking for is hapless. But he was a prisoner of events. We haven't even mentioned the Whipless Seven or whatever, who all resigned the whip over Europe, and the fact that he had to resign as Prime Minister or resign as Conservative leader.
To sack me.
Oh, my Lord, the chaos. But in the end, he probably by... Okay, we had a crash in 92, which was horrific. End of Thatcher. And in those days, you would not hose money in. So the whole country, everything crashed. All the properties, people lost their jobs, they lost their homes. And actually, if you have that, there is a bit of a purging process. And by the time Blair came in, we were back on track and ready for a boom. So Blair could look in his rearview mirror and say, thank you, John, for that.
And of course, Kirsty, just going back to Labour's kind of modesty of its ambitions, one of the big pledges was to stick to the Conservative spending plans for the first 2 years.
Which they did, remember. So, in fact, nothing huge happened in those 2 years that was going to cost anything more than those pledges, which actually were so modest, because they were so terrified of seen as being profligate. They were so terrified that there was so much to do, and they couldn't do it. They were very lucky, actually, when they came in, because in those first few years, for example, I don't seem to remember there was any particular need for huge amounts of defence spending, for example. They had pledged what they did for education and a new education programme. They pledged what they were going to do for the NHS, which proved to be woefully little. But actually, there was nothing much happened in those first 2 years apart from the Parliament. And that was massive, absolutely massive.
Also, the two really strong memories I have, one is a true one and one is a false one. The true one is that just a few weeks after the 1997 election, and there's sort of such a feel-good factor in the country, Britain won the Eurovision Song Contest with Katrina and the Waves.
Wow.
So that added to the mood of excitement. And then my false memory is that John Major actually had quite a good campaign, because he went out on his soapbox and was just going to town centres and chatting to people. But that was actually the 1992 election.
Correct.
That wasn't 1997 at all.
Yeah.
No. You just wished it to be true because it would have been quite interesting.
Right. Let's end on some big thoughts then, because we've discussed a lot of small anecdotes and big themes in these last two episodes. Jeremy, do you want to have a final thought?
If you look at the span of Major to Blair, so you go from 1992 to 2007, which is 15 years, you see how we now telescope everything. So Blair would be in trouble within weeks of coming to office, and Major would have gone probably in 91. And it actually benefits us to stretch things out a bit. I think there's something, stability comes partly from electing someone and committing to them, I think is the lesson for our times.
Kirsty?
I think for me, the big thought is how people can get things wrong. In 1997, George Robertson, who was Shadow Scottish Secretary, said devolution would kill nationalism stone dead. Whereas Tam Dalyell said that devolution, what does he say? Devolution is a motorway to independence without an exit ramp. Both were proved wrong, but the shape of politics in the UK changed forever after 1997. And, we now have a parliament in Scotland, we have a parliament in Wales, for, whether you like it or not, it's all changed. And everybody publicly backs the idea of these things. And that was absolutely unimaginable before the 97 election, though in fact a lot of people had supported the idea of independence. They just supported the idea of devolution. They just hadn't found the right way forward.
I think my takeaway is 1997 sort of became the benchmark for what sort of a good election victory and a strong government looked like. But actually, it was a bit of an outlier, really. And actually, our politics has always been, people are always saying, oh, that's what success is in politics. But actually, it was a really unusual, spectacular success that Blair had. And actually, we maybe shouldn't be using 1997 and the amount of stuff that he could get through Parliament, or the amount of changes he made, or the size of his majority, and how that then actually made change. And actually, our politics has always been a bit more chaotic, and that's...
But if you're Blair, I think you regret you won a massive majority and you threw it away. I mean, he didn't. Where were the nuclear power stations? We're in a situation where the reservoirs, where the big projects didn't happen.
But what I would say, what has changed for the good massively, is that that ghastly photograph of Blair's babes, which was just appalling, of course. But we have actually gone through an arc in terms of women coming into Parliament, women in senior jobs. Look at that whole lineup in 97, all the men, the Blair men, going into that election. What you've also got is the same in Scotland, but sadly what you've also got is the arc going down the way when women are thinking now, after the social media onslaughts and everything else, is it really worth it? And I think that is desperately sad, because I think some of our most talented politicians are women.
Here's a thought. When we got a new Prime Minister the other day, Andy Burnham, the Sun didn't lead on it. Isn't that incredible?
Yes, because
they led on
Prime
Kevin
Minister
Keegan.
is
They
not
led
a
on
big
Kevin
deal.
Keegan, which arguably is a more important story.
Wow. Isn't it interesting? Our successors will be doing an old newscast about that day. Maybe we'll get to be guests on it.
About Andy Burnham's...
Yes, exactly.
Believe me, they won't be doing a newscast on that, I don't think.
Honestly, it'll be AI. The BBC will just be AI.
Oh yeah, you'll be able to choose who do you want to present your old newscast. Do you want Jeremy Vine, that old has-been, or do you want Dame Kirsty Wark, or do you want Adam Fleming? Whatever happened to him?
Oh well, he's living in a Bahamian island now, sunning himself.
Yeah, podcasting doesn't pay that well. So there we are. Tony Blair is firmly ensconced in Downing Street, where he will stay for a decade. Jeremy, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And Kirsty, thanks to you too.
Thank you.